Welcome to the M1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Sadu, and today we're going to be exploring the ego. So I wanted to put this podcast episode together because I think that the ego is really misunderstood, and it has a pretty negative connotation around it in general. So I wanted to take a closer look at this thing we all have called the ego. So I was introduced to the concept of the ego just like everyone else was. You hear about egomaniacs that only see themselves and their own needs. You hear about being egocentric. You hear about folks that are super vain and only care about how they look because they're constantly feeding and appeasing their egos. And then my mentor, Joseph Maldonado, who's been on the podcast a few times, by the way, introduced me to a whole different side of the ego and its different aspects. So that's what we're going to be exploring more so today. It turns out we're actually born without egos, and then they're developed so we can be functioning members of society, meaning we're born essentially as a blank slate, and then our parents, our grandparents, friends, siblings, society itself, etc., help to form this self-identity or ego. Now, there's a general overarching ego itself, and then there are three subcategories or aspects to it. And those three subcategories are the child, the parent, and the adult. So let's break each one down here. The child ego is exactly what you think it would be. It is childish, it's fun, it's excitable, naive, silly, insert whatever word here you'd like as far as how you would describe a kid. The parent ego is exactly what you think it would be as well. It is protective, conservative, it sets boundaries, it implements rules and limitations, and the list goes on. And then we have the adult. So the adult is the aspect of the ego we want to rely on or use most of the time. The adult understands how life works. They're neither a child or a parent necessarily, even though they know they can access either one whenever they'd like. Adults use the right tool for the right job, and they are neither childish nor overly conservative or parental. Now let's dive even deeper into each of the three aspects. So what are some typical things that you'd hear the child ego say, or how can you know when it's running the show? Children want what they want when they want it. They don't understand how the world works because they're children and they haven't had enough life experience to know that life is all about trade-offs. If they see a toy that they really like, the first thing they say to their parents is, "I want that." The concept of money and how you have to work for it in order to buy toys isn't a construct that they understand yet because they're kids. But the child ego can show up in quote-unquote adults all the time. And when I say quote-unquote adults, I just mean chronologically. So someone who is, say, 21 years old and up, it's an arbitrary number, but you get the idea. You might even notice your child ego pop up in regards to food. So remember, the child wants what it wants when it wants it, and it doesn't understand the concept of cost benefit. So if you're expecting to eat like an asshole every day, but you also expect to have a six-pack while you do it, your child is in charge of your relationship with food. Reason being is your child wants it all while simultaneously not wanting to sacrifice anything. It's unrealistic because, again, it doesn't understand how the world works. It doesn't ever want to feel deprived or like it can't indulge in whatever desire it fancies or pops into their head. The child also has little to no patience. It wants results yesterday. The child eats well for a week and wonders why it hasn't lost 10 pounds or reached its goal yet. Again, unrealistic and completely detached from reality. Having said that, the child ego isn't all bad, not in the slightest. There are times in life where accessing your inner child is the best strategy. And one of the most obvious ones is when you're interacting with a child. You want to think like they think. You want to wonder and explore and play and get excited. You don't want to bring serious Sally to a kid's birthday party. You'll be no fun at all. So you bring your child ego and you have fun with it. How about the parent? So the parent ego has fairly definitive ideas of good and bad, right and wrong, safe and unsafe, and for good reason, right? Because a parent's job is to keep their kids alive. Now, we all possess this aspect of the ego, even if we're not actually parents yet or at all. And the biggest input here as far as how our parent ego is formed and plays out is by watching how our parents parented us. That's the default parent voice. And we actually parent ourselves all the time. Maybe you're going to buy something that you can't afford. Your parent voice might kick in and be like, Marcus, you shouldn't buy that. That would be irresponsible of you because you can't afford it right now. Funny enough, you might actually have an internal dialogue between your parent and your child at that point. And your child might throw a little bit of a tantrum, and your parent's job is to reel things in and look at reality. These are the voices in our heads, right? We've all got them. And the most important thing about this whole ego concept is not trying to eliminate any of the voices. It's using the right tool at the right time, or essentially paying attention and implementing the right approach, or voice you could say, given the situation at hand. Like we talked about before, the parent is much more conservative than the child, and they actually balance one another out quite nicely. It is definitely worth looking at how you parent yourself. Are you too easy or too soft on yourself? Or are you an overly hard or harsh parent with yourself? An example of being too soft could be constantly rewarding yourself for good behavior, but to a point where you sabotage. So you eat well for 2 days and then you reward yourself with an indulgence meal. But if your goal is fat loss, that's an awesome way to just spin your wheels and get no results. So in this case, the parent would need to be more diligent and a little bit harder, you could say. And then on the other end of the spectrum, an example of being too hard or harsh would be giving yourself no rewards, no days off, and running yourself into the ground. That approach doesn't work either. So it's helpful to look at how your parents parented you because that's your default. But fortunately, the parent ego is totally malleable and changeable with awareness, so you can actually shift it. Now let's take a look at the adult. So we said the adult understands how the world works. They get cost benefit and the concept of trade-offs because the adult knows that when they say yes to one thing, they're potentially saying no to 1,000 other things. They know that it isn't smart to indulge in any and every desire like the child wants to do if it's in charge, right? But they also don't need to be overly conservative like the parent. So the adult is sort of like a middle ground between the child and the parent. Now the adult ego is open. It listens. It has balanced opinions, or as close to balanced as possible. It seeks to understand and see where people are coming from. Essentially, it sees and understands its own needs as well as other people's needs. And then in contrast, the child only sees its own needs, and the parent has what it thinks to be the greater good in mind, first and foremost. And then the adult sees and understands the whole picture, right? So an example of the adult in a food situation could be something like this. Let's say your goal is fat loss and you walk by a pizza joint and instantly your child goes, I want, right? The parent kicks in and then says, you shouldn't do that. And then the adult thinks, well, I could have the pizza, but obviously there's a trade-off to make as far as my results go. Is it worth it? Am I willing to pay that cost? It's really that simple. The adult isn't pulled by the I want voice. It's also not run by the parent's should or should not voice, but it takes a step back, it looks at the big picture and just makes a decision from there. And this next part is really important. The adult doesn't beat themselves up after for decisions that they make because they're just that, they're decisions. They chose to have the pizza or they didn't, but the choice was made from a place of being aware versus simply being pulled or run by that child voice or the parental voice. The adult isn't impulsive, and therefore they don't have regrets because they make conscious decisions. If you look at your fat loss results or behaviors at the end of the week and you're disappointed or upset, just know that your adult was not making all of those food decisions. Now, you might be thinking, man, the adult sounds boring as hell. It's so calculated and every decision is so well thought out. Now, you do not need to implement this stuff with every decision, okay? Meaning you don't need to consult your adult around whether you want to go to the park or to the movies. We're not talking about small, super arbitrary decisions. We're talking about choices that really make a difference in your life. So given this information, how do we use the right tool for the right job, aka the right voice or approach for the situation we find ourselves in? The most important thing is awareness. And I know that's sort of a fluffy sounding concept, but you can insert whatever word here you want, like focus or attention, whatever. Essentially, you just need to be observing yourself, right? You can't be walking around oblivious and unaware. If you're going through your day unconsciously, you're going to be running on default, and therefore whatever aspect of your ego that has the strongest pull that day is going to make your decisions. And when it comes to nutrition and your health, just hope that it's not your child, because if you let a kid decide what they want to eat all day long, it's not going to be single and minimal ingredient whole foods that are healthy for you. It's going to be cereal for breakfast, a grilled cheese for lunch, and then ice cream for dinner. Now, it's definitely worth noting, none of these constructs are necessarily good or bad. They're just aspects of our egos that are all super important. And it's just that we want to use the right tool for the right job. So you'd prefer your child not run your financial life, but if you're out and about in the world traveling, for example, and coming across some beautiful landscape, your child is a perfect part of you to be in wonder, looking at how beautiful the view is. However, you don't want your child booking your hotels because it's going to book the nicest place available without a second thought to cost. I hope you guys are getting the picture that I'm painting here. Having said all of that, the ego itself, including its three aspects, is not you. It's also not the enemy. It's not good, it's not bad. It's actually a really cool and creative construct that we all have. It's not the ego itself that gives us problems per se. We run into problems when the ego runs us versus us running it. So a super useful question you can ask yourself throughout the day is, who's in charge right now? What part of my ego is making this decision? Is it the child, the parent, or the adult that's running my financial life, for example? How about my health decisions? What about my relationships? Who's showing up most often there? These questions can begin to have you become more aware and observe yourself, because if you want to change any aspect of your life, it takes conscious effort and consistency, as you well know. If this whole ego conversation intrigues you and you want to learn more, I linked some YouTube videos below from my mentor, and I would highly recommend watching the movie Revolver. It's directed by Ritchie, and it is brilliant. Being that you now understand the three aspects of the ego, it'll have you see the flick with entirely different eyes. It's amazing. Now, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, feel free to reach out on any of my social channels, via email, anything like that, and I would be happy to delve deeper into this stuff with you. If you'd like to apply for one-on-one nutritional coaching or workout programming with me, you can click the link in the show notes below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. Feel free to follow me up on Instagram at n1fitness and friend me on Facebook at Marcus Sadu. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next episode. See ya.